The same mechanism that traps people in addiction is also the one that sets them free. Neuroplasticity doesn't care about intentions, values, or mortality. It doesn't take sides, it strengthens whatever gets practiced. The brain is loyal to repetition, not righteousness. That neutrality is why destructive habits can become terrifyingly strong, and why recovery is possible using the same exact biological rules. Here is the encouraging twist, hiding in plain sight. Every act of resistance is not just psychological effort, it is a physical training for the prefrontal cortex. Each time you don't give in, tissue changes. At the neural level, resisting an urge is an active process, not a passive one. The prefrontal cortex doesn't merely say no, it fires specific inhibitory patterns that directly suppress habit and reward circuits. Those patterns leave traces, and traces accumulate. When you resist a habit or addiction, prefrontal cortex neurons fire in coordinated inhibitory sequences. GABA is released to quieten basal ganglia output. Downstream motor plans fail to reach threshold. Dopamine is withheld from the urge circuit. Plasticity shifts toward control rather than compulsion. That's not symbolic effort. It is circuitry doing work. You are physically changing your brain from the inside. So it's indeed a little bit hard, and it's indeed going to take a lot of time. Over repeated resistance, the prefrontal cortex adapts in predictable ways. Inhibitory synapses strengthen via long-term potentiation. Communication between prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia becomes faster. Fewer spikes are needed to suppress urges. Inhibitory signals arrive earlier in the impulse timeline. Restraint begins to feel more automatic. The prefrontal cortex behaves like a trained system because it is being trained. The same learning rules that automate habits also automate self-control. Early resistance feels effortful because the circuitry is underdeveloped. Later resistance feels lighter because the wiring has improved. At the same time, the habit circuit is quietly starving. And that's exactly why I made that video titled Starve Your Idea. If you are interested, you can check that out. When a habit is not preformed, several reinforcing processes fail to occur. Reward prediction drops, dopamine doesn't spike, synapses receive no reinforcement signal, dendritic spines begin to shrink, metabolic support is withdrawn. Without repetition and dopamine, the habit pathway loses its privilege. Microglia, the brain's maintenance cells, start pruning underused connections. Receptors disappear, signal transmission slows, thresholds rise. If a habit circuit is a neural highway, repeated non-use doesn't blow it up, it cracks it. Fewer receptors catch neurotransmitters. Signal propagate more slowly. Coordination across the circuit degrades. Activation becomes less reliably. Eventually, the pathway struggles to ignite. That's not punishment, it is conservation. The brain reallocates resources to circuits that prove useful now. But resistance alone isn't enough. The brain despises empty space. If you remove a behavior without replacing its function, the old circuit remains tempting because it still solves a problem. Relief, stimulation, regulation, escape, you name it. Recovery succeeds when resistance is paired with construction. Every time you choose an alternative behavior, new synapses form. A competing habit loop activates. Dopamine begins tagging the alternative. Emotional relief becomes associated with the new pattern. The brain updates its predictions. That is very important because we have talked earlier about how the brain is simply a prediction machine. And here's an intuitive way to understand it. The real change is not just don't do X, but in fact it is build Y until Y wins. Charlie Morgan taught me about that. He talked about something called the inversion law or something like that. But the same idea applies here. You don't focus on destroying X, but you are focusing on building Y until Y becomes very strong and more effective than X. Then something remarkable happens. At first, impulse circuits dominate. Inhibition feels exhausting. Resistance requires constant vigilance. Later, inhibitory control strengthens. Urges weaken and arrive later. Resistance becomes easier. Alternatives feels more natural. Eventually, the old habit no longer feels like you. Emotional charge fades. Craving failed to reach threshold. The impulse becomes a faint electrical suggestion. What once felt like a monster turns into background noise. The big insight is simple and radical. Addiction and recovery obey the same biological laws. Repeated firing strengthens circuits. Repeated suppression weakens them. Dopamine reinforces what it rewards. Absence of reward allows decay. Nothing mystical, no inner war, just plastic tissue responding to training. Every time you choose differently, you are sculpting circuitry, not symbolically, not metaphorically, literally, like physically, for real. The brain you are building today is the brain that will act tomorrow.